Have you watched Laura Trump's music video, Marianne?
I've watched parts of it on Twitter that have been circulated.
Without your bravery, we're all out of luck. No, this can't be denied. You gotta be special.
Is this the first time that you've seen a co-chair of the Republican National Committee appear in a music video? I feel like it's the first time for me.
It kind of reminded me of when Paris Hilton wanted to go into music, but has many interests.
She has many interests in the closing 8 weeks of a campaign.
Yeah, I was like, who has produced this music video?
Welcome to the Campaign Moment from the Washington Post. It's Wednesday, September 4th. I'm Aaron Blake, senior political reporter and writer of the Campaign Moment newsletter, and I'm joined here today by Marianne Levine, a national political reporter at the Post covering the 2024 election. Hey, Marianne.
Hey, thanks for having me.
So today I wanted to talk about swing states, and specifically the ones we should be paying the most attention to. Now, of course, there are a lot of swing states out there, but not all of them are of equal importance. And as this campaign has been moving forward, there has been an increasing focus on a couple of them in particular. And so I want to get into that today. As a reminder, Vice President Kamala Harris and former President Donald Trump would each need at least 270 votes in the Electoral College in order to win the election. And the 7 key swing states that people generally talk about are usually the same: Michigan, Wisconsin, Arizona, Nevada, North Carolina, Georgia, and Pennsylvania. Marianne, can you just start by talking a little bit about how these states are looking right now in the polls and how the two candidates are performing?
Yeah, I think at the end of the day, when we look at these 7 battleground states, this race is still very much a toss-up. A lot of these states are within the margin of error when it comes to looking at the individual battleground states. And we don't actually have a ton of polling that's out there from the individual state level. Now, the Washington Post has our very helpful polling tracker that we update on a daily basis. And right now, we have Trump leading in 4 of the 7 battleground states. He's leading in Nevada, Arizona, and North Carolina by less than a point. In Michigan, Harris is leading by less than a point. In Georgia, Trump's leading by 2 points. And in Pennsylvania, the Washington Post polling average has her leading by 3 points.
Yeah, and I think it's important to note that, as you mentioned, these are all within the margin of error. Pretty much every poll we see these days is within the margin of error. I think we got some on Wednesday where 1 or 2 states were actually outside of the margin of error, which is kind of exciting because it's actually we can say somebody's ahead in this state. But the race is just very close. And then when you also layer on top of that the polling errors that we've seen in recent cycles, it's just very difficult to say with any real certainty where the race stands in any of these states. So 7 states all looking very close right now. But I've been looking even more closely at 2 states in particular this week. One of them is Georgia and one of them is Pennsylvania. These seem to be the states that the Trump campaign in particular, at least, seems to be focusing more on, at least when you look at its ad reservations. Can you just tell me a little bit about how you think these 2 states are shaping up and what you're seeing from the campaigns in them?
I think if you talk to both campaigns, they really do emphasize the importance of Pennsylvania. Harris's path to 270 gets very, very difficult if she does not win Pennsylvania. It's almost a must-win for her. And I think we can really see how important that state is based on the ad reservations. We did a recent story that published this week that looked in part at all the ad reservations. And right now, Democrats are spending nearly $69 million. Republicans are spending $66 million in television ads just related to the presidential in Pennsylvania. And that's a significant increase from the other swing states that we're seeing in terms of TV ad spending. So I think that it gives us an indication of how important Pennsylvania is. Harris and Biden were in Pittsburgh this week, and Trump has gone back to Pennsylvania pretty frequently. In the last few weeks, he's holding a town hall there this evening. So I think we can tell how important that state is just based on the candidates' TV ad spending and their travel schedules. For Georgia is a very important state to win, especially for Trump. He is leading there still, at least based on our polling, but Harris has closed in the margins. And I think one question we have in terms of looking at the polling data and looking at the margins getting closer is how much of that is Democrats coming home, Democrats who were not maybe excited about voting for Biden and who are maybe going to sit this one out, but are more excited about Harris. That seems to be a big reason why we're seeing her close the gap with Trump in Georgia. I think that a lot of Republicans still see them having the advantage in Georgia. I mean, when you look at how Republicans are spending money in TV ad spending, Georgia, I believe, ranks second after Pennsylvania, which I think speaks to their priorities there.
This is something that really struck me over the weekend and really was the impetus for the piece that I wrote, which was these ad reservations but from the Trump campaign in particular. I should note that, people might not really know what ad reservations are. Basically, these are the states where the campaigns are intending to advertise over the rest of the campaign. Those reservations can be canceled. They can shift to other states. But it is notable that they haven't reserved as much money in these other states. And it is notable because it gets more expensive as you get later in a campaign to buy that ad time. You have an incentive to reserve the states that you think are going to be important early on. And right now, what the Trump campaign is doing is it is investing a huge amount of its ad reservations in both Pennsylvania and Georgia. In fact, I asked the political data firm Ad Impact on Tuesday for the rundown of each state. And as of right now, for the rest of the campaign, about 80% of the money spent on the Trump campaign's ad reservations are focused on these two states specifically. So there is a huge imbalance, at least on the Trump campaign side. The Harris campaign is spreading the wealth a lot more. They are spending across these 7 states and not investing so heavily in Georgia and Pennsylvania. They're also spending a lot of money in Michigan, also spending a lot of money in Wisconsin. But I think this is a real window into how the Trump campaign may see their path to victory. And I think it has a lot to do with the political math. If you look at the Electoral College map, there is a path for Donald Trump to win by carrying Pennsylvania, carrying Georgia, and holding on to North Carolina, which is a state that he's won twice before. That gets him to exactly 270, the number of electoral votes that you need. And it is the only path by which Trump can win with just 3 of the swing states. And so we don't know a whole lot about why those ad reservations are geared towards those 2 states right now. The Trump campaign hasn't come and said, this is our path to victory or something like that. But I think it is telling about where kind of the central battlegrounds in this race could be moving forward.
Your point also about North Carolina, I think, is really interesting because Trump has gone there almost as much as he's gone to Pennsylvania in the last few weeks. And I think that speaks to how crucial the campaign sees North Carolina as being part of their map. And I think it's especially notable because Democrats haven't won North Carolina in a presidential since 2008. Look, I think that in a sign of how important Georgia is, the Trump campaign has made it very clear that they are now united with Georgia Governor Brian Kemp. Trump, back in August, had a rally in Atlanta that I was at where he spent more time at his rally in Atlanta attacking Georgia Governor Brian Kemp than he did Vice President Kamala Harris. And it sort of speaks to their longstanding feud over the 2020 election results, and which a lot of Georgia Republicans see as very much a losing issue for Trump. And so I think the fact that he went there, attacked Kemp, and then a couple weeks later, there was a detente that kind of took place between the governor and Trump. I think that speaks to how important Georgia is, because a lot of Georgia Republicans, when they saw Trump's comments at that Atlanta rally, started to get worried and started to have concerns that he would divide the party in a very critical swing state and that would make him lose Georgia once again.
Yeah, and I think it's worth emphasizing that Brian Kemp isn't just your average Republican governor of a swing state, which is, that's important in and of itself. He is also someone who is hugely popular right now. I think there was a poll last week, a Fox News poll, I believe, that showed Brian Kemp actually was approved by half of Kamala Harris supporters in the state. His approval rating was north of 60%. So this is somebody who has demonstrated very broad appeal in a state that Donald Trump would very much like to win. So I think a lot of people looked at Trump's sudden reversal on Brian Kemp and thought, oh, he's starting to take Georgia a little bit more seriously here. So we've been talking a lot about Georgia and Pennsylvania, but you also mentioned how much Trump has been in North Carolina here. And we shouldn't overlook that state because to the extent this is Trump's path to victory, he needs North Carolina as well. This is, of course, as we mentioned, a state that Trump has won in both of his two campaigns, unlike these other 6 swing states that we're talking about. Why do Democrats think that North Carolina can be competitive again this cycle? And how much is this risking them trying for something that remains elusive for their party?
Yeah, I mean, I think North Carolina often feels like the white whale when you talk to Democratic strategists, because I
Right.
feel like when you talk about the Senate races there or the presidential races, it's always viewed for many cycles now as a potential possibility for Democrats. I mean, I think it is notable that North Carolina does have a Democratic governor, Roy Cooper. They have a very controversial Republican nominee, Mark Robinson, who's running for governor of North Carolina. And I think a lot of Democrats are hoping they can kind of capitalize on that gubernatorial race to potentially bring more voters to Harris. I think it's also worth noting that there are similarities too between Georgia and North Carolina, and I think they
Right.
probably see a similar blueprint for both of those states. But it's worth noting that North Carolina does have more rural voters than Georgia, and so I think that that is one difference between the two states. So the states are a little bit different, but I think you would see a very similar playbook that you see in Georgia. And so I think a lot of Democrats see similarities between those two states and therefore are hopeful about North Carolina, given that they won Georgia in 2020.
Yeah, and I've really been struck by how North Carolina is basically polling just as competitively as Georgia is right now, just as competitively as a lot of these other states. It's basically a 1-point margin in the Washington Post polling average. We're going to take a quick break there. When we come back, why Trump's bet on Georgia and Pennsylvania could actually be somewhat risky. We'll be right back. So, to the extent that Donald Trump is betting so heavily on Pennsylvania, Georgia, and of course, North Carolina, there is an argument to be made that that's a pretty risky strategy. I would say the first reason is because he's focused narrowly on some states and not spending as much money in others. The second is because Kamala Harris looks to be in reasonably good shape in Pennsylvania right now. And if Trump loses one of these states where he's investing heavily, he would have to essentially win a couple other states where he's not spending much money right now. So, Marianne, do you think that this campaign is going to be focused on these two states moving forward, or is the Trump campaign going to have to kind of spread the wealth a little bit more in the closing weeks?
I think they're definitely going to have to spread the wealth. And I think they are to some extent. I mean, Trump is going back to Wisconsin this weekend. He was there just last week. I think that he is still traveling to Michigan, Wisconsin, Nevada, all the other swing states. I think what's telling is how much he's investing in terms of ad money, but that's not the only metrics. And I think one of the metrics that we have to look at is also where is he actually holding campaign rallies. And I think it's notable that he is holding a rally in central Wisconsin on Saturday, about a little over a week after having a town hall in La Crosse, Wisconsin. So I think they're not writing off the other states. Chris LaCivita, who's a top Trump advisor, his co-campaign manager, has a lot of experience in Wisconsin, previously worked on Ron Johnson's campaign. So I think that we're going to be able to see what their strategy is based on where he's traveling and where he's campaigning. And I think he has spent time in Michigan. He has spent time in Wisconsin. He held a rally in Arizona during the week of the DNC. And so he is still getting around there. And there's also campaigns also have individual calculations of how expensive the ad markets are in some of these states and also how much reach they think they're going to get based on the ad spending. So it's definitely a great metric to use, but I feel like not the only metric. And I think his schedule will be very telling in terms of where they're seeing the need to deploy him.
Yeah, and where we might see these ad reservations cropping up in the days and weeks to come, although we are going to see voters start voting very shortly here.
Yeah.
North Carolina sends out absentee ballots starting on Friday. We, of course, have the debate next week, and then about a week later, we start to see early voting in some states across the country. So the decisions being made about where to invest, what to focus on, are starting to actually matter and have real significance a lot more in the coming weeks than they have, for example, in August. Marianne, what are some of these other things that you kind of watch as somebody who's trying to get a beat on where this race is headed?
I think it's really helpful to talk to officials in the state, especially about ground game and where they're seeing volunteers. Are they seeing door knockers? Are they seeing mail from the different campaigns? And I think it's really important, too, to talk to voters who are not going to Trump campaign events or Harris campaign events, but really trying to get out into the areas surrounding where the rallies or the campaign events are and talking to people about what messages are actually breaking through to them. So I think just spending time on the ground, talking to voters, and then also getting a sense from county officials, from state party officials about what they're seeing on the ground. Are they confident in the ground game is something that I think we're going to be paying very close attention to in the next few weeks.
Yeah, this is a really big question, and I wanted to get your take on where things stand on it right now. The ground game is hugely important, and there is, I think, certainly in recent weeks there has been a surge in people who have been anxious to get out there and help Kamala Harris since she came onto the scene, and there's lots of enthusiasm for her. Have we got a real good sense for how the two campaigns' ground games actually compare right now? Like, not necessarily in raw numbers, but kind of generally in how they're perceived as being effective right now?
Yeah, I think it's hard to say at the moment because I think that one person told me when I was covering the primary that everyone talks about what a great ground game it was for the whoever wins. So no one ever says, oh, that campaign lost, but they had a really great ground game. So I think oftentimes how good the ground game is determined in the aftermath of the election results. But I mean, the Harris campaign clearly likes to talk about, how many volunteers they have, how many field offices they have, and that's something that they really, put out in their memos. They, mentioned that they've had trainings on Project 2025, the Heritage Foundation initiative that Democrats are trying to campaign heavily on. And so I think that that's one metric in which the Harris campaign is trying to show that they have momentum is by saying they have volunteers, they have these field offices, and that they laid the groundwork very early while Biden was the nominee. Now, for the Trump campaign, they don't really talk as much about field offices or what field offices they've opened up. I think we reported this week that they have about 18,000 volunteers. I think they're trying to use a very similar approach to what they used in Iowa, which is you get volunteers from a specific community and then they reach out to their neighbors and get them to vote. And it's this model that they used during the Iowa caucuses that they're hoping to use again in the general election, where they're trying to get different team captains and getting them to talk to their friends to vote and sort of spreading it that way within their communities. So I think it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. Another thing that the Trump campaign is doing this time is they're really working pretty closely and coordinating very closely with outside groups like Turning Point.
This is the youth conservative organization.
Exactly.
Turning Point,
Yeah, exactly. And it'll be interesting to see how effective Turning Point actually is at turning out voters and getting them to come out in some of these key swing states.
We're gonna have to leave it there for today's episode. Thanks so much, Marianne.
Thanks for having me.
Marianne Levine is a national political reporter covering the 2024 election for The Washington Post, and I'm Aaron Blake, senior political reporter. Don't forget to subscribe to my newsletter, which is also called The Campaign Moment. You can find a link in our show notes and at postreports.com. And if you don't already, make sure that you're subscribing to the Campaign Moment podcast feed. That's where you can find episodes like this one, in addition to our regular Friday chat on Post Reports. Today's episode was produced and mixed by Ted Muldoon and edited by Lucy Perkins and Mary Jo Murphy. We'll see you later this week.